Welcome back to the show. We're continuing our discussion on the staggering number of people locked up in America's prisons. Joining me now from Stanford is Joan Petersilia. She's spent 30 years studying the U.S. criminal justice system, and she is the co-director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center. With me here in Washington is Grover Norquist. He is one of the leading conservative voices in America, and he is the president of Americans for Tax Reform. And from Nashville, Tennessee, Alex Friedmann. He is a former prisoner, and he's the managing editor of Prison Legal News. Welcome to all of you to the show. Alex, let me start with you. You've served time. You know what it's like to be inside a prison. We also heard from Bernard Kerik earlier on. He told us what it's like to be inside prison. Tell us what the experience was like coming out of prison. Did you feel that you've paid your debt to society, now you should be given a second chance, and did you get that second chance?
Well, in a nutshell, yes. I mean, when people complete their criminal sentence, they finish their term of parole, then they have fulfilled their debt to society that was imposed upon them by a jury or a court. That is in theory, but in practice, most ex-prisoners, including myself, when they get out of prison, experience great difficulties in reassimilating into society. And that's partly because while you're incarcerated, you're basically time stops still. Everything outside goes around you and continues on, but for prisoners, basically time stops. And they're kind of frozen in that moment. And when they get out, everything has changed. There's new technology, new things that they have never seen before. When I was first incarcerated, the internet did not exist. When I got out, of course, things had changed drastically. But some things don't change, such as the difficulty for ex-offenders to find jobs or to find housing. So people who get out of prison, including myself, had a very difficult time trying to simply resume a normal life.
So, as Bernard Kerik pointed out, you continue to pay the penalty even though you have served your time. Joan, let's go to you. You've studied the criminal justice system for 30 years. There are now something like 2.3 million Americans that are locked up. How did it get to that level?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One is that we got very tough on crime. We stopped believing that we could rehabilitate offenders. I think that allowed us to go to the legislatures, and the legislature started passing law after law which mandatorily imposed a prison sentence, whereas we would have sent somebody to community alternatives in the 1970s and 80s. So the prison population just grew dramatically over the last 40 years.
Grover, you know, one of the things about prison reform is that the cause brings together very strange bedfellows. It brings them from the right, from the left. It's liberal, conservative, call it what you will. You're a conservative. Why are you pushing so hard for prison reform?
Well, there are a series of reasons. One is that the cost has gotten staggeringly high. Over the years, as we've put more people in prison, we spend at least $50,000 a year to put someone in prison for a year in California, $25,000 in Florida. The prison union guards have made it prohibitively expensive to keep people in prison. But then there's the question of how are you benefiting society by keeping a 75-year-old bank robber in prison for another 5 years? Is that person a threat to society? How can we reduce crime, punish crime, and reduce it? Do we really need to have that many people in prison for that many years? And a lot of the mandatory minimums where legislatures, federal or state, came in and said you have to have a sentence at least this big, came because there were judges that were making some pretty bad calls. And people reacted very strongly to a sense that they weren't taking this seriously. So they said, we don't trust you, we don't trust the whole system, and we're going to insist on these minimums. And then to show how tough you are on crime, the minimums drift upward, because every time something happens, you have to move those forward. So it got more expensive, but also more destructive to individuals' lives, guilty people and their non-guilty families, and the communities you took them out of.
Right. So it's not just costs that you look at, but you talked about the cost of incarcerating people. Would you be happy with the government spending money on rehabilitating people? You know, Bernard Kerik spoke about boot camps for small-time offenders, people who are caught with small amounts of drugs, for instance, who are getting these lengthy sentences. He says it's better if you run a boot camp where people are taught how to behave in society, how to be acceptable to society. Would you be would it be acceptable to you if government spent money on things like that?
Well, I think one of the things that Texas, which has put forward several of the very interesting innovations that have actually continued crime to drop in Texas and cost less, is allowing people, local governments and state government to say, look, you have this much money. You can take some of it and put it into higher touch probation and parole. So you don't have to put it all into prisons. There are other alternatives. There are drug courts is one way to look at it. And then there's questions you have to ask is, should some things be either illegal, or should they be, if they're illegal, do you really have to put people in prison as the punishment for something being illegal? Perhaps there are 4,000 federal crimes that you can put someone in prison for. Okay. List 7. Okay, I mean, this is ridiculous. There shouldn't be that many federal crimes. Perhaps we need to rethink how many things we put people in prison for, period.
Okay. Joan, let me go to you again. And what has been your experience in studying this for 30 years? I mean, do you find that people are put in prison sometimes for what are not very serious offenses? I mean, like the possession of drugs. I mean, it's sometimes first-time offenders. It's sometimes people who have not been involved in this before, or they have basically not had any problems with the law, but yet they get these long sentences, and then they come out, and as Alex pointed out just a few minutes ago, then they have problems being accepted by society again. So they turn to crime again.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that we've over-criminalized and we've over-incarcerated. And so we're now trying to back out of what was the drug war and the incarceration war. I think, as Mr. Norquist mentioned, the costs, both social and financial, are now just unsustainable. And so we're trying to think, the key question is, if not prison, what? So certainly we just need to get out of some people's lives. And we've over-criminalized very small quantities, et cetera, and possession of drugs. But the harder question is, what do we do with, say, the first-time property offender, the residential burglar, the robber? What penalty is, what can we do to assure that they return home in a way that is not damaging to the community? And so I think that the wave of the future, I think everybody agrees that we've gone too far with prisons.
Okay.
And so the harder question now that I think is what kind of community alternatives will both work and cost less?
Alex, the United States has a constitution which guarantees equality before the law, but that doesn't seem to be the case in many instances. I mean, I was looking at some figures, and it shows that African-American males are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white males. And critics say, of course, that the system is unfair. We know that. It's unfair particularly to the poor, and particularly people who are either African-American or Latino. And the numbers seem to suggest that, don't they?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question that there is a racial bias in our criminal justice system, and research has shown that that bias is manifested everywhere from policing in terms of who is arrested to who is charged with certain crimes and those who are convicted and the sentences they get. There's a bias at every stage of the criminal justice system that tends to channel particularly minority defendants into prisons. That being said, as you noted, I think the larger issue of bias in our criminal justice system is socioeconomic. So people who have wealth and means can make bond and get out of jail. They can hire attorneys, they can hire jury consultants and experts, and they tend not to go to prison, or if they do, it's for short periods of time where they get probation and so on. So we do have kind of a dual-track system, one of which is for wealthier, more well-to-do defendants, who tend to be white, and the other for impoverished defendants who tend to be minority.
Grover, are you seeing some movement now in your campaign to get the prison system reformed? I mean, there is talk in Congress to get this reformed. For instance, the U.S. Commission on Sentencing, which is an independent agency, voted unanimously just a short while ago to reduce the sentencing, the amounts of sentence that a person could get in prison, the guidelines.
Yes. When you look at the list of things that they're mandatory minimums for, I testified in Congress against the idea of mandatory minimums, and specifically the ones on crack cocaine versus white powder cocaine with a 100-to-1 differential, an idea thought up by the Black Caucus years ago. Is now people say it's racially biased. It was actually promoted by Rangel and others because they thought it was useful or important to take it away. It was delayed so many years because people were yelling racism when that wasn't what drove the legislation. It was actually put forward by the very people who now want to get rid of it. Part of it's disentangling right and left. Politicians
why was
are
it put
afraid.
forward then? Was this
They thought it was a blight on the black community, crack cocaine, and so they pushed the penalties up to try and knock it down. But then in retrospect, they then said, now we don't like what we did. But when they wanted to sit there and blame other people for what had happened, they said, we're not changing the law with you attacking us, as if we'd done this, and that's not happening. So only when both sides agreed to stop yelling at each other, we got a unanimous vote in the House because it had to be done by unanimous consent. Any one person could have said no to moving the 100-to-1 ratio to 18-to-1. Why it's not 1-to-1, I'm not quite sure, but somebody thought 18 was a good number. It's less than 100. So, look, liberals are afraid if they make a move, conservatives will accuse them of being weak on crime. I would argue that in the 60s and 70s, they were. They earned that, okay? So now we've got to figure out how to make some reforms so that neither side feels they can be hurt in the next election by stepping out too fast. And that's why it's taken so long.
Okay, I want to get Joan's view on this very quickly, Joan, before we take a break. Joan, do we find that the law is actually inconsistent across the country? I mean, let's look at a situation like the one that exists in Colorado right now, where people can go and legally buy marijuana, smoke it, use it, do whatever they want to, and yet there are people in other parts of the country who are serving long terms for having small amounts of the same drug.
Well, what's important to understand is that corrections policy is state policy. For the most part, I mean, the federal system gets a lot of attention, but actually it's smaller or about the same size as California's prison population. So every state creates its own penal code, decides who it wants to go to prison, how much it's willing to spend, whether or not it is going to have parole, what kind of treatment programs it's going to offer people in prison and out of jail. So we have, you know, every state has its own prison policy, which is why it is so difficult to get the nation to move either up or down consistently. The very, very negative part of having all the states in charge of their own systems is, of course, that we have widespread disparities across the country by state. And so that we get incarceration rates that were very, very high in Texas, and in places in the South, much less, in the Northeast and in the East, about moderate in California. And so to really understand prison policy, you have to go to the state level.
Okay, lots more to discuss on this very important issue, America's prison system. We'll have more in just a few minutes. Stay with us. You're on The Heat.